So probably the last two arguments we'll deal with today, going back to the free will thing, and I think these are fascinating because irrespective of what you believe about free will, I think these let me see what you think. So God, and I did mention this very briefly last time, which is God has no free will. So remember, God has full divine foreknowledge. God knows about all future events. And all counterfactuals and everything, but also God knows about his own future events, which is to say that God has predicted of himself, or knows of himself, what he's going to do in 10 years, 20 years, a million years, right? And also God is constrained by his own nature, which means that every action that God does is constrained by having to be the most loving, the optimal loving it can be, but also taking into account that he knows everything and that he's the power to do otherwise, or whatever. He has omniscience, omnipotence, and omnibenevolence. So with those characteristics, God's actions are constrained, but then he's got infallible foreknowledge of the future. So if he predicts he's going to make a cup of tea at 9:30 on a Tuesday morning, like in 3 months' time, then that is a prediction that is infallible, which means when it comes to 3 months' time, he absolutely has to do that, because if he doesn't do that, it would invalidate his own foreknowledge, which means that God isn't omnigod. So if God is omnigod, God has no free will, because he literally has to do what he knows he's going to do, and God cannot act contrary. He doesn't have the freedom to act contrary to his own inerring future. So God is just an automaton on these railroad tracks going into the future, and there is no wavering from that course. Literally, he cannot waver from his own predicted future, and I think that's a really interesting thing.
It's basically exactly like us, but with the foreknowledge.
Yeah, his own foreknowledge is what conspires to put him in a straitjacket such that he can't move from doing what he's going to do.
It's almost a curse, because at least you and I, even though we're condemned to do what we're always going to be doing, but because we don't know it yet, it's at least you get that illusion of freedom. He doesn't even have that.
No,
that will drive him insane.
Exactly. And then you start thinking about other things like, so when we talk about, I think conversations about what is rationality are interesting. And again, we touched on this last time, like when we talked about how the universe without time, you couldn't think, right? So God couldn't think causally prior to creating the universe because time wouldn't exist. So there's no temporal thought processes. But thought processes in and of themselves, when you deliberate on a decision, so you're deciding whether to do X or Y, right? And that's a moral decision. And you're thinking about it. You go, okay, but then what about that? And so you have a 5-minute conversation with yourself, which is deliberating. But actually, and we say, oh, that's rationality. No, that's inefficient rationality. That's actually really inefficient rationality, because you're kind of half remembering some things. You're thinking about it for a time. Then you're bringing into account this. And then you're deliberation is just imperfect rationality. A computer just goes, bish, bash, bosh. There you go. You set out all its programming, its rationality programming, and it goes, bish, bash, bosh, decision made, right? Whereas we go, oh, let's think about that. So God would never deliberate about anything, because that suggests that God wouldn't know the answer straight away and would have to be thinking about stuff to kind of cogitate upon it and come across the right answer. God would know straight away. There would be absolutely no thinking involved. So God is, so the reason I bring that into to play here is because if you think God is like this single automaton on a railroad track, actually God can't even think or spend time thinking. It's just a computer machine that just, there's no deliberation. It's just like answer, or like calculation, most loving, and this is it. Do you know what I mean? It's God is the ultimate divine robot.
That is quite. So, what do you say then to the Noah's flood, where in the Old Testament there's a bit of regretting on God's behalf here when he saw and the infamous rainbow to remind, as a post-it note to remind himself not to kill again.
Of course, you get. I mean, this is going back to God and anatomy. You get all these anthropomorphic stories in the Bible, which is making God look like a human, because this is written by people 2,500 years ago who haven't done all this philosophizing, right? Of like, yeah, God walks among us, God gets angry, God gets jealous, God changes his mind. God can do any of those stuff if you believe in this abstract God. We're going back to this. So you've got this God in the Bible that changes his mind at Nineveh, who regrets things, who's jealous, couldn't find Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, all these kind of things. And then you've got the God up here that all of that stuff is impossible for a God up here. And you're like, how do you marry these? Well, you can't. And so you have to say, I mean, I can't disagree or agree. I'm not really sure. Maybe. So I guess, yeah, realistically, God is a divine robot, and there will be no regretting, really no getting jealous, because that's weird. Because things like jealousy and anger, also, there's arguments you can say these are things that we understand in evolutionary psychology that offer functional benefits because we've evolved them to be beneficial for us to have. So jealousy has a use, anger has a use, happiness has a use, right? But if God doesn't have a body and never went through evolution, all those things that are that we can really only properly understand within their evolutionary paradigm and context don't really apply to God.
Maybe Nick Bostrom's high simulation theory, maybe he's onto something here.
Yeah, so he says, probabilistically, we're more likely to be living in a simulation than not. And that God could be some. I mean, I guess the idea is, are we just a big game of Sims for God, or something? I don't know, but certainly God, for me, if God is going to be omni-God, he wouldn't have personhood, and he wouldn't have free will. Now, the problem is, free will is supposedly a great making property. So when you talk about humans, you say, well, what theists say is a theodicy for explaining why they're suffering. They say, well, there's all this evil on earth because it's humans' fault, and that they've got free will, and that's why. And it's a collateral of free will because they make bad decisions. But they say all those bad decisions and all that suffering is worth having because free will is such an important thing. So what they're saying essentially is, in perfect being theology, is that free will is a great making property. It's really good to have free will. Now, the greatest being is God in such a theology. And so therefore, if you're going to have a great making property, God must have free will. If it's a great property, is a great making property, he must have it to the nth degree. And yet, from what we're discussing here, God has it to the 0th degree. Like, God just can't have free will. And God just has a necessary nature out of which his entire behavior and actions are determined, and he knows in advance what's going to happen, and there's no deliberating, and there's only calculation, and it's just bosh.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, in some mythologies, especially in the Greek mythologies and other mythologies, the gods have created man, and they start witnessing man exercising the free will that was endowed by gods. And if they start to become jealous of that freedom and the fact that they are not, they can surprise gods and themselves, like by active redemption, active sacrifice, and altruism and things, and gods who cannot deviate from their own nature started to look with jealousy at that agency they've created that exercises more freedom than they can do.
This is a Tower of Babel. The look at them becoming like us, stretching us up to heaven to become like us. And this is another etiological story. This is a perfectly etiological story. Obviously mythological. Of course, we can build higher skyscrapers than that by a country mile these days. So it's a load of rubbish. But they build these ziggurats, and God gets annoyed. In fact, the gods get annoyed. I think, again, it's plural here. They're becoming more like us. So it spreads them all around the world and gives them different languages so they can't work together to speak to each other. What is a function of that story? So the question should always be, when you read biblical stories, is what's the author trying to do here? Don't look at this historically and literally. Like, this isn't a literal story. This is an etiological story. What they're trying to do, they're trying to explain why different people speak different languages. That's all that story is really doing. It's like, well, if everyone came from the same place, from the Garden of Eden and blah, 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 then how come everyone now speaks loads of different languages? Like, so this is something
the other
that needs
one
explaining.
Human collaboration is overrated.
Yeah, it's like,
Don't do it.
Just
Bad
to let you,
idea.
it's like, God, mate, I'm sorry. I know we haven't spoken for a long time, but just to let you know, in case you haven't seen what's happened over the last 2,000 years, we've just flown to the moon and like stood on the moon, right? And you punish people for like building a ziggurat, right? And we've literally flown to the moon and we sent probes out far further. And
It's one of the best things we've ever devised: human collaboration. We
Yeah.
come up with crazy cool stuff because of human collaboration.
Why would you punish human collaboration? Oh, it's just ridiculous. Just what a silly story. But it's obviously it's an mythological story, and that's how you should understand it. But no biblical literalists will have it another way. So, and the last argument is that okay, if God doesn't have free will and God is necessary, and this creation out of God, you could argue, is a necessary creation, just emanates out of God. Just suddenly we pop into existence from God world, and if God knows the future events of all of us and everything on earth, then everything on earth is immutable. So God is immutable and unchanging, but the earth is immutable and unchanging, as in unchanging from what it will be and can be. It can only be one way. And there is no way that anyone can deviate from what God knows will happen. And I think that's really worth like dwelling on, because if you believe in divine foreknowledge, the entire universe is just some elaborate set of dominoes that is just falling to exactly how God knows it's going to fall. And then you're like, well, if God knows it's going to fall in exactly this way, infallibly, then why bother doing it if it's going to cause all this pain and suffering? This just looks, you just start going, well, why? What's going on here? Like, you're watching something that you know is going to just topple in.
So, Jonathan, a question for you here: does foreknowledge here constitute design? Because this is one of the arguments, or the counter arguments, that come from the theists, that God's foreknowledge does not mean design. He just knows what you're going to be choosing, but he's not actually proactively designing what you're going to be choosing.
Well, this is I don't put a lot of store in these kind of arguments. I find a real problem. It's kind of like I'm watching a DVD, right? And I know it's a film I've watched like 10 times. One of my favorite films. I watch it 10 times. I know exactly what's going to happen, but I'm not making it happen. I'm just watching it happen, and I know what's going to happen, but I'm not making it happen. But yeah, but that's not a really good analogy, because actually you are God and you've designed the entire universe in which that DVD and blah, 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 blah. So it's like you are creating, if you are designing reality and creating reality, knowing, and before you've created it, you know what's going to happen, in the same way that you know the counterfactuals of all potential universes, and you don't create them, but you do create this one knowing what's going to happen, then even if we are freely doing that stuff, you're still responsible for us freely doing that stuff, because we wouldn't have freely done that stuff if you hadn't have just created this entire universe knowingly in which we are going to do that stuff. But then you get onto what's called the grounding objection, and this is an objection to like middle knowledge and Molinism, which is one way that theists argue that God has knowledge about whatever. But the grounding objection is like, in order for God to know that in this particular causal circumstance, I'm going to do this, right? Which means that in a different causal circumstance, I wouldn't do that. Or in that same causal circumstance, someone else wouldn't do that. To know that I'm going to do that in that causal circumstance means that there must be something that grounds my doing that in that causal circumstance. And this is, of course, where, you know, what we understand about causal determinism, which is like, well, to link my behavior to this particular causal circumstance is to say that this causal circumstance and my own causal circumstance of my genetics and biology in past is grounding all my decisions, which is like the free will debate writ large. So in order for God to know that we are going to do certain things in certain situations, we must have those events grounded in that situation, which is to say they are causally determined. What are they determined by? Well, the entire universe at any given time is determined by the previous instantiation of that universe, which is to say that, well, God designed that universe in that way such that that would happen. Therefore, we're back to God. So there's no way that even with, like, it's the whole idea that that God knows what we're going to do, but doesn't make us do that, forgets the fact that God created and designed everything, knowing that we would, that would make sense if you didn't have this whole, well, it could have been any other way. But God...
Your argument, even though the God is not designing every minute of your actions and interactions, but because he's the creator of the blueprint of who you are and the circumstances, he's actually, it's like you're orchestrated to do what you're going to be doing. He does not need to intervene in every little thing, but it's enough that by creating the blueprint, your psyche, the circumstances around you, you're always going to be doing what you're doing. So therefore, he's still a culprit.
Yes, and everything that happens is what God wants. So there's not one thing that takes place, like we talked about last time, stubbing your toe, tsunami. There's not one thing that takes place in this universe that God doesn't want, or at least want because it begets a greater good. So therefore, this is how it is, and this is how God wants it. And if he wanted it any other way, he would have it any other way. Of course, this is arguments against Satan as well. It's like, well, if God wants to get rid of Satan, he could just get rid of Satan like that. He doesn't. Therefore, Satan is God's middle manager. So, God could have created all sorts of different universes, but God created this one. So therefore, we didn't create this one, and God created us and designed us in a way that this is what we do, and God knows that we're going to do it. So yeah, it just gets back to that problem again. And when you talk about it, it's worth having a little sort of think about the sorts of things that I was going to read a list. It's later in the book, actually. I have to find it later. I will read a little quote from page 45 that kind of sums this up. But it also invalidates God's own free will because it cannot act contrary to its own predictions about its own behavior, as I said before. Given that God can only create in a way that fulfills its own omni nature, and given that God can only do one thing, that God has infallibly predicted, and humans can only do one thing, what God has infallibly predicted, then this world must be a set of unerring dominoes falling down in a pattern set out from the outset. Nothing can change. Not God's mind, not God's decisions, not humans' decisions. Nothing about the world or reality from how God imagined and predicted it back at the very beginning. If you're a theist who believes in such a God, just think about that for a while. Consider the ramifications. God is immutable, unchanging, and unchangeable, and so is human behavior and the world at large. Perfectly so. God can't be surprised about it either. The universe is a clockwork machine playing out in the exact manner and to the exact outcomes that it designed and created. Either that, or God doesn't exist, or God is not omni-God.
And therefore not a god.
Yes,
maybe a super being of some sort, but not a god.
Exactly.
Not worship worthy.
Not omni-God. Yeah. And so, as Ray says here, God has designed the universe in such a way that I write a bunch of books against God's existence, and that has to be a net benefit to the world. Because if that is gratuitous suffering, then it wouldn't happen. So therefore, it's a net benefit to the world that I do that. But of course, we're going to get onto another argument, which is moral paralysis that comes out of this same argument, which is that if you see someone being beaten up on the other side of the road, you shouldn't step in to intervene, because actually that's how God's designed it, and there can be no gratuitous suffering. So to stop an old granny getting beaten up, you are stopping a net benefit from taking place. So therefore, and that's a real problem. So it's like there are so many problems with the whole omni-God, but we'll talk about that on another day.